The harsh wind cut across the frozen expanse like a knife, slicing through Josephine Lambert's threadbare coat as she sat shivering by the ice-locked river, her tears turning to crystals on her cheeks. 3 days since the stagecoach robbery had left her stranded in the wilderness of Wyoming Territory, 1876, 3 days of wandering, hoping to find civilization before winter claimed her life. Josephine clutched her valise tighter, the last of her worldly possessions inside, along with the letter that had prompted her journey west. The letter promising a teaching position in Silver Creek, a chance to escape Philadelphia and the scandal that had driven her away. At 22, she had believed herself brave enough for this adventure. Now, as the sun began its early winter descent, she wondered if she would see morning. The sound of hoofbeats penetrated the howling wind. Josephine raised her head, hope and fear warring within her, traveler or bandit. Salvation or further peril, a tall figure on horseback emerged from the tree line, leading a packhorse behind him. The rider slowed as he spotted her, his hand moving reflexively to the revolver at his hip. Even through her near-frozen state, Josephine noted his watchful caution. "Madam." His voice carried across the distance between them, deep and questioning. Josephine tried to stand, but her legs had long since gone numb. "Help," she managed, the word barely audible through chattering teeth. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as he approached. Beneath his wide-brimmed hat, she caught glimpses of a weathered face, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes the color of the summer sky she feared she'd never see again. "Good Lord, what are you doing out here alone?" He knelt beside her, taking in her blue-tinged lips and frost-nipped fingers. "Stagecoach, robbed," she stammered, 3 days ago." Without hesitation, the man shrugged out of his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, felt like heaven against her frozen skin. "I'm Matthew Evans," he said, his voice gentler now, "ranch owner about 10 miles east of here." He assessed her condition with a practiced eye. "You won't make it much further on foot, especially not with night coming. My place is closest." Josephine tried to protest, remembering her mother's warnings about strange men, but the alternative was certain death in the Wyoming wilderness. "Can you ride?" Matthew asked, already helping her to her feet. I think so," she managed, though her legs nearly buckled beneath her. With surprising gentleness for a man of his size, Matthew lifted her onto his horse, securing her valise to the packhorse before mounting behind her. One strong arm encircled her waist, holding her steady against him. "Lean back," he instructed. "Body heat's the quickest way to warm you." Too exhausted and cold to argue propriety, Josephine did as she was told, feeling the solid wall of his chest behind her. As they rode through the gathering darkness, she drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them and the secure hold of the stranger who had found her. "Stay awake," Matthew said sharply, jostling her when her head lolled. "Talk to me." "What's your name?" "Josephine Lambert," she replied, forcing her eyes open. "I was traveling to Silver Creek, teaching position." "Silver Creek's another day's ride from here," he said. "You're lucky I found you. Mountain lion's been active lately, not to mention the cold." "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got to get you warmed up proper." They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, the landscape barely visible in the fading light. Finally, through the swirling snow, Josephine made out the dark shape of a building, a substantial log home with smoke curling from the chimney. "Home," Matthew said simply. A dog's bark greeted them, followed by the appearance of a grizzled older man who hurried from a nearby barn. "Matthew was about to come looking for you. Who's this?" "Found her by Clearwater River, Samuel, nearly frozen. Stagecoach robbery victim." The older man, Samuel, immediately took the reins of both horses as Matthew dismounted, then reached up to help Josephine down. Her legs gave way as soon as her feet touched the ground, and Matthew caught her, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. "Get the door," he instructed Samuel, who hurried ahead to comply. Inside, the cabin was blessedly warm, a roaring fire in the large stone fireplace casting dancing shadows across the rustic but comfortable furnishings. Matthew carried her directly to the hearth, settling her gently in a rocking chair positioned there. "Samuel, we need hot tea and whatever's left of that stew," Matthew said, kneeling to remove Josephine's frozen boots. "I can do that myself," she protested weakly, embarrassed by the intimate gesture. "Your fingers are too numb," he countered, already working on the laces. "And these need to come off before your feet thaw, or the swelling will make it worse." Josephine surrendered, watching as he handled her feet with clinical efficiency, examining them for frostbite. "You're lucky," he pronounced. "No black spots, should heal just fine with proper care." Samuel returned with a steaming mug which he pressed into her hands. "Drink this, miss. Whiskey and tea best thing for the cold." Josephine sipped cautiously, the liquor burning a fiery path down her throat and into her stomach. Warmth began to spread through her, and with it came the painful tingling of returning circulation to her extremities. "I don't know how to thank you both," she said, looking from Matthew to Samuel. "No need for thanks," Matthew replied, rising to his feet. "No decent man would leave anyone to freeze. Samuel, here's my foreman, been with the ranch since my father's time." "Evans Ranch raises the finest cattle in the territory," Samuel added proudly, "and horses too." As the warmth returned to her body, Josephine became increasingly aware of her situation alone in a remote cabin with two strange men. Yet something about Matthew Evans' straightforward manner reassured her. He hadn't looked at her with anything but concern since finding her. "I need to get to Silver Creek," she said, setting down the mug. "The school term begins in a week and they're expecting me." "You'll not be going anywhere for at least a few days," Matthew stated firmly. "Not until this storm passes and you've recovered your strength." "But my position, I'll send Samuel to Silver Creek tomorrow with a message explaining the delay," Matthew interrupted. "It's only 15 miles as the crow flies, though longer by the safe trail. The school board will understand they're not heartless." "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," Samuel cut in. "Been meaning to go to town anyway, need supplies." Matthew nodded. "That's settled then. Now, Samuel's brought you stew. After you eat, we'll get you settled in the spare room. It was my mother's, so it's proper enough for a lady." Josephine felt a blush rise to her cheeks, though whether from the whiskey or his consideration she couldn't say. "Thank you, Mr. Evans." "Matthew," he corrected. "Out here formalities don't last long," she smiled tentatively. "Matthew then, and I'm Josephine." As she ate the hearty stew, Josephine observed her rescuer as he moved about the cabin, stoking the fire, speaking quietly with Samuel about ranch matters. There was an easy competence in everything he did, a quiet authority that suggested a man comfortable with responsibility. Later, when Samuel had retired to his quarters in the barn and Matthew showed her to the promised bedroom, Josephine paused in the doorway. "I've never been in debt to someone as I am to you," she said softly. Matthew shook his head. "No debt between neighbors, Josephine. Get some rest." Morning comes early on a ranch. As he turned to leave, she caught his arm. "Your coat, you should take it back. Keep it for now," he replied. "Plenty more blankets in the chest if you need them." Alone in the room that still carried faint traces of lavender and lemon, his mother's scent, perhaps Josephine unwrapped the buffalo coat from her shoulders. It was heavy, well-worn but meticulously maintained, and carried the scent of leather, horses, and something distinctly male that she now recognized as Matthew. She ran her fingers over a neat patch on one sleeve, evidence that its owner valued practicality over appearances. Setting it carefully over a chair, she wondered about the man who wore it, the man who had, quite possibly, saved her life. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin's windows. Josephine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. Her body ached, but the deadly cold had receded, replaced by the soreness of survival. The smell of coffee and bacon drew her from the bedroom. She'd slept in her clothes, having nothing else to change into after her trunk had been taken in the robbery. Self-consciously smoothing her wrinkled dress, she emerged to find Matthew alone at the stove. Samuel left at first light. he explained, glancing up at her. Should reach Silver Creek by midday. Coffee, please. She accepted the steaming cup he offered. I hope I haven't disrupted your routine too badly, Matthew shrugged. Winter's a quieter time on the ranch. Cattle are in the sheltered pastures, most hands gone till spring roundup. Just Samuel and me, and old Pete who tends the barn when Samuel's away. He set a plate of eggs and bacon before her, then joined her at the table with his own breakfast. You mentioned a stagecoach robbery, he said after a few moments. Did they take everything? Josephine nodded, grateful for the simple food. Everything except this dress and my valise, which I had beside me. My trunk with all my clothes and books was on top. Bandits have been troublesome lately, Matthew frowned. Sheriff Dalton does his best, but the territory's vast and his deputies few. They didn't harm me, Josephine hastened to add. Just left me with the other passengers. We walked together until reaching a fork in the trail. The others were bound for Casper, while my path led toward Silver Creek. We parted there, each believing we were closer to our destinations than we were. Matthew's expression darkened. They left you alone, knowing Silver Creek was still 2 days' travel. The gentleman with us offered to escort me, but he had a wife and child with him heading the other direction. I insisted I would be fine. She lowered her eyes. I was foolish and overconfident. No, Matthew said firmly. You were brave if unprepared. This country doesn't forgive mistakes easily, but you survived. Thanks to you. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. What brings a young woman from Philadelphia, is it, all the way to Wyoming Territory to teach? He asked, breaking the moment. Josephine hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. A fresh start, she finally said. And you, have you always lived here, born and raised on this ranch? Matthew replied, allowing her to change the subject. My father came west after the war, the Mexican War, that is. Built this place from nothing. When he and Mother passed 5 years ago, it became mine. It's a beautiful home, she said sincerely, looking around at the solid construction, the handcrafted furniture, the small touches that spoke of permanence and care. It serves its purpose, he said, though she detected a note of pride in his voice. Now you should rest today. Your body's been through an ordeal. I couldn't possibly just sit idle while you work, Josephine protested. There must be something I can do to earn my keep. Matthew studied her for a moment, then nodded. If you're feeling up to it, the mending basket's overflowing. Samuel and I are handy with many things, but needle and thread isn't among them. Relief flooded her. That I can certainly manage. As Matthew donned his hat and another coat, not as warm as the buffalo one he'd given her, she noted with a pang of guilt Josephine settled by the window with the promised basket of mending. Through the glass, she watched him move around the ranch yard, checking animals, splitting wood. His movements economical and sure throughout the day, he returned periodically to stoke the fire or bring in more wood, each time checking on her progress and condition. By afternoon, Josephine had worked through most of the mending, finding satisfaction in the simple, useful task. When Matthew came in for the evening, stamping snow from his boots, his eyes widened at the nearly empty basket. You've been busy, he observed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. It was therapeutic, she admitted, and the least I could do. That evening, as they shared another simple but hearty meal, conversation flowed more easily. Matthew spoke of the challenges and rewards of ranching, while Josephine described her education and teaching aspirations. Neither pressed the other on the deeper reasons that had shaped their current circumstances, respecting the privacy that frontier people instinctively granted one another. As darkness fell, the wind rose again, howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. Another storm coming, Matthew observed, glancing toward the window. Samuel will likely stay in town tonight. Josephine felt a flutter of nervousness at the realization they would be alone in the cabin, but quickly chastised herself. This man had saved her life, treated her with nothing but respect, and shown no sign of impropriety. Will your cattle be safe? She asked, genuinely concerned. Matthew smiled, seemingly pleased by her question. They're in the sheltered valley with windbreaks. Cattle are tougher than they look. Later, as they sat by the fire, Matthew rose suddenly. "I nearly forgot. I have something that might fit you." He disappeared into his room, returning with a folded garment, a simple blue dress. "It was my mother's," he explained, holding it out to her. "She was taller than you, but otherwise similar in build. Might need taking in, but it's clean and whole." Josephine accepted the dress with trembling hands, touched beyond words by the gesture. "Matthew, I couldn't possibly, she'd want you to have it," he said simply. "No use sitting in a trunk gathering dust." Examining the dress, Josephine saw it was well made but not fancy, a practical garment for a rancher's wife. "I'll return it before I leave," she promised. "Keep it," he said, turning back to the fire. "Consider it part of your welcome to Wyoming Territory." The next morning, Josephine emerged from her room wearing the altered dress, having stayed up late adjusting the hem and waist. Matthew glanced up from his coffee, a flash of something like pain crossing his features before being quickly masked. "It suits you," he said quietly. "Are you sure? If it brings back difficult memories, no," he interrupted. "It's good to see it being worn again." "My mother was practical above all things. She'd approve." The storm had passed during the night, leaving a crystalline world outside, the snow glittering under a brilliant blue sky. Despite the cold, Josephine asked to accompany Matthew on his morning rounds, eager for fresh air and movement after her ordeal. "Bundle up," he instructed, handing her his buffalo coat again, "and stay close." The ranch was larger than she'd initially realized, with several outbuildings, corrals, and a substantial barn. Matthew showed her the spring-fed well that never froze, the smokehouse where meat was preserved, and the root cellar stocked with vegetables for winter. "You're entirely self-sufficient," she observed admiringly. "Have to be," he replied. "Town's too far for regular trips, especially in winter." At the barn, Josephine met old Pete, a wizened man with a pronounced limp who tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam," he greeted her. "Heard how the boss found you. Lucky thing." "Indeed it was, Mr. Pete." "Just Pete, madam. Never had use for more name than that." Inside the barn, the warmth and smell of hay and horses enveloped them. Matthew introduced her to his favorite mount, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder. "He's beautiful," Josephine said, cautiously extending her hand to the animal, who snuffled her palm curiously. "He likes you," Matthew noted with surprise. "Usually takes to strangers about as well as I do." "And how well is that?" she asked, a teasing note entering her voice for the first time. Matthew's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Not very." As they continued the tour, Josephine became increasingly aware of Matthew's physical presence beside her, his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he instinctively offered his arm when they crossed icy patches. There was something profoundly reassuring about his solidity, his unassuming competence. By afternoon, clouds had gathered again, and Matthew hurried to complete his chores before the weather turned. Josephine insisted on helping prepare dinner, discovering a well-stocked pantry that spoke of careful planning. "You cook for yourself and Samuel?" she asked, kneading dough for biscuits. "Have to eat," he replied with a shrug. "Nothing fancy, but we manage." "My mother would be scandalized to hear of men cooking for themselves," Josephine smiled. "In Philadelphia, such things simply aren't done in respectable households." "Out here, respectability takes different forms," Matthew said. "A man who can't fend for himself doesn't last long." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Josephine felt a growing comfort in Matthew's presence, as if they'd established a rhythm together despite having known each other only 2 days. When their hands accidentally brushed as they reached for the same utensil, the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the cooking fire. That evening, as snow began falling again outside, Matthew surprised her by producing a checkerboard. "My father insisted I learn," he explained, setting up the pieces. "Said it taught strategy and thinking ahead." "My father taught me as well," Josephine replied, delighted, though my mother considered it unladylike to be too competitive. Matthew raised an eyebrow. "And are you competitive?" Josephine's smile turned mischievous. "Terribly." They played for hours, evenly matched, each winning and losing in turn. Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months, especially when Matthew's competitive streak emerged to match her own. "You play like you do everything else," she observed after a particularly cunning move on his part. "Quietly but thoroughly. And you play like you've got something to prove," he countered, not unkindly. Josephine's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps I do." Sensing he'd touched on something significant, Matthew studied her across the board. "We all have our reasons for being where we are," he said carefully. "No need to explain them unless you want to." Gratitude washed over her at his understanding. "Thank you for that." They retired soon after, the comfortable silence between them speaking of a growing trust and friendship. In her room, Josephine found herself thinking of Matthew's hands as they moved the checker pieces, strong, capable hands that had carried her from certain death into warmth and safety. She wondered what those hands would feel like against her skin, then immediately blushed at the inappropriate thought. Matthew Evans was her rescuer and host, nothing more. In a few days, once Samuel returned with word from Silver Creek, she would continue her journey and likely never see him again. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Matthew's voice in conversation with another man. Dressing quickly in her borrowed dress, she emerged to find Samuel had returned, stomping snow from his boots by the door. "Miss Lambert," he greeted her. "Town sends its regards and this." He held out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "What is it?" she asked, accepting it curiously. "Ladies' things," Samuel replied, looking slightly embarrassed. "Stopped at the Mercantile and asked Mrs. Palmer what a lady teacher might need, having lost her luggage. She put this together." Touched by the thoughtfulness of people she hadn't even met, Josephine carefully unwrapped the package to find a hairbrush, comb, ribbons, handkerchiefs, and other small necessities. "That's very kind," she said sincerely. "I'll be sure to thank Mrs. Palmer when I reach town." "About that," Samuel exchanged a glance with Matthew. "School board says not to rush. Terms delayed on account of the weather. Most outlying families can't get their children to town anyway until the snow eases." "Oh," Josephine wasn't sure whether to feel disappointed or relieved. "Did they say how long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, Samuel replied. "Said to tell you your position's secure and they're arranging temporary lodging with the minister's widow when you arrive." Matthew, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up. "You're welcome to stay here until the road's clear. No sense making the journey twice." Josephine hesitated, conflicted. Propriety demanded she not impose further on Matthew's hospitality, especially as an unmarried woman. Yet the prospect of staying in a hotel in Silver Creek for weeks, alone and using funds she could ill afford to spend, was equally unappealing. "I wouldn't want to be a burden," she began. "You're not," Matthew said simply. "You've already worked through most of our mending, and frankly, the cooking's improved since you arrived." Samuel nodded vigorously. "That it has, miss. Boss here can manage beans and bacon, but those biscuits last night were a blessing." Josephine laughed despite herself. "Well, if my biscuits have earned me a place." "Then it's settled," Matthew said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "You'll stay until the school's ready for you." As Samuel went to tend the horses, Matthew lingered, seeming to want to say something more. "There's no obligation," he finally said, his voice low. "If you'd be more comfortable in town, I understand." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "I feel safe here," she admitted. "And useful. That means more to me than you might guess." Something in Matthew's expression softened. "Then we're agreed." Over the next several days, a routine emerged. Mornings began with Matthew heading out for early chores while Josephine prepared breakfast. They would eat together, sometimes joined by Samuel or Pete, before each attending to their respective tasks for the day. Josephine had taken over much of the cooking and indoor work, freeing the men for the more physically demanding ranch tasks. In the evenings, they would gather by the fire, sometimes playing checkers or cards, other times simply talking or reading in companionable silence. A week after her arrival, Josephine was kneading bread dough when Matthew entered the cabin, his expression troubled. "Everything all right?" she asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Tracks along the north fence line," he replied, hanging up his coat. "Could be nothing." Or could be the same gang that robbed your stagecoach, scouting for livestock to steal. Josephine's hands stilled in the dough. Should we be worried? Matthew considered her question seriously. Not immediately. Ranch is well defended and most rustlers prefer easier targets. Still, I've sent Samuel to alert the neighboring ranches. That evening, Matthew cleaned his firearms at the table, a procedure Josephine had seen before, but which took on new significance given the potential threat. She watched his methodical movements, the way his strong fingers disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled each weapon with practiced ease. "Have you ever had to use them?" she asked quietly. "Against people, I mean." Matthew's hands paused briefly. "Twice," he admitted. "Once when rustlers tried to take a herd 5 years back, again when a drifter thought to rob the place last winter." "Did you kill them?" wounded the rustler. "The drifter ran off after I fired a warning shot." He met her gaze across the table. "I don't take life lightly, Josephine. But I will protect what's mine." The intensity in his blue eyes sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. There was something profoundly appealing about his quiet strength, his unflinching acceptance of the responsibilities that came with his way of life. "I'm not afraid," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not with you here." Matthew's expression softened, and for a moment, Josephine thought he might reach across the table and take her hand. Instead, he returned to his task, though a certain tension remained in the air between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken possibilities. The next day brought heavy snow, confining them mostly to the cabin. Josephine used the opportunity to further explore Matthew's small but surprisingly well-stocked bookshelf. "You read quite widely," she observed, running her fingers along the spine's Shakespeare alongside practical manuals on animal husbandry, history texts beside poetry. "My mother's influence," Matthew explained, looking up from the leather bridle he was repairing. "She was a schoolteacher before marrying my father, insisted education didn't end with childhood." Josephine selected a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. "My father loved Wordsworth," she said softly. "He used to read to me when I was small." "Is he still living, your father?" Josephine shook her head. "He died 3 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry," Matthew said simply. After a moment he added, "My parents died within months of each other. Father from a fall during Roundup, mother from pneumonia the following winter." "It changes you, doesn't it?" Josephine said. "Losing them makes you grow up fast," Matthew agreed, "though I was already a man when it happened." Settling in the chair opposite him, Josephine opened the book to a favorite poem. Without prelude, she began to read aloud, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. Matthew's hands stilled on his work, his attention wholly fixed on her as the beautiful words filled the space between them. When she finished, the silence felt different, intimate and fragile. "You read well," Matthew said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Thank you. It's part of teaching, being able to bring words to life. The children of Silver Creek will be fortunate to have you." The mention of Silver Creek brought a twinge of something like regret to Josephine. Her time at Evans Ranch was temporary, a pleasant interlude before resuming her intended path. Yet increasingly, she found herself wondering what it would be like to stay to wake each morning to Matthew's quiet presence, to build a life in this beautiful, harsh country. Such thoughts were foolish, she knew. Matthew had shown her kindness and respect, but nothing to suggest he viewed her as anything more than a temporary responsibility, a neighbor in need. And she had her own reasons for needing the independence a teaching position would provide. That night, as wind howled around the cabin, Josephine lay awake longer than usual, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Matthew moved about in his room across the hall. So near, yet separated by more than just a wooden door. The next morning brought a break in the weather, though the accumulated snow made travel beyond the immediate ranch yard difficult. Samuel reported that the north fence line remained secure, with no fresh tracks to indicate intruders. The day passed uneventfully, with Josephine helping Matthew inventory supplies in the root cellar. "We're well stocked for winter," he noted with satisfaction, "even with an extra mouth to feed." I hope I'm not depleting your reserves too badly, she said, only half joking. Matthew's gaze was steady. You more than earn your keep, Josephine. Truth is, the place runs smoother with you here. The simple statement, delivered matter-of-factly, warmed her more than any elaborate compliment could have. I've enjoyed being useful, she admitted. In Philadelphia, much of what I did seemed ornamental. Here, everything has purpose. That's the frontier for you, Matthew replied, strips life down to essentials. They worked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the confined space. Each time it happened, Josephine felt that same inexplicable warmth spread through her, a growing awareness of Matthew not just as her rescuer, but as a man. As they emerged from the cellar, Josephine paused, struck by the beauty of the snow-covered landscape glittering under the afternoon sun. Without thinking, she reached out and touched Matthew's arm, directing his attention to the view. It's magnificent, she breathed. Matthew looked from the vista to her upturned face, something shifting in his expression. Yes, he said quietly, it is. For a long moment they stood together, neither moving away. Josephine became acutely conscious of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his tall frame, of the way his eyes lingered on her face. The spell was broken by Samuel's voice calling from the barn, announcing a visitor. Matthew stepped back, his professional demeanor returning as they made their way toward the sound. The visitor proved to be Sheriff Dalton, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd ridden out from Silver Creek with news. Caught 2 of the stagecoach robbers, he announced after dismounting. They were foolish enough to try selling some of the stolen goods in Casper. Any of my belongings among them? Josephine asked hopefully. The sheriff shook his head. Sorry, miss, they'd already disposed of most items. But they gave up their partners 4 more men heading north toward Montana Territory. At least they won't trouble us again, Matthew said, offering the sheriff coffee inside the cabin. As they gathered around the table, Sheriff Dalton studied Josephine with open curiosity. School board's mighty pleased you survived your ordeal, Miss Lambert. Silver Creek's been without a proper teacher since old Mrs. Winters passed last spring. I'm looking forward to beginning, Josephine replied sincerely, though Mr. Evans' hospitality has made the delay quite bearable. The sheriff's eyes moved between her and Matthew, a knowing look crossing his weathered features. I'd say it's worked out well for both of you, he commented. Evans' ranch has needed a woman's touch since Martha passed. Matthew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Josephine is our guest until the school term begins, Sheriff. Nothing more. The correction, though politely delivered, carried a finality that effectively ended that line of conversation. Josephine felt a curious mixture of embarrassment and disappointment at Matthew's emphatic clarification of her status. After the sheriff departed with promises to return if there was news of the remaining bandits, an awkward silence fell between Josephine and Matthew. She busied herself with dinner preparations, while he attended to outdoor chores despite the fading light. When they finally sat down to eat, the easy companionship of previous days seemed diminished. Matthew was polite but distant, responding to her attempts at conversation with short answers that discouraged further dialogue. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Josephine set down her fork. Have I offended you somehow? Matthew looked up, surprise replacing the guarded expression he'd worn since the sheriff's visit. No, why would you think that? You've barely spoken 10 words since Sheriff Dalton left. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of discomfort. I apologize, it's not you. Then what is it? He hesitated before answering. The sheriff has a habit of making assumptions and spreading them as fact. I didn't want you subjected to gossip. You mean because I'm staying here? Josephine asked, understanding dawning. You were protecting my reputation. People in small communities talk, Matthew said simply. Especially about newcomers. I didn't want your position at the school compromised before you even begin. His consideration touched her deeply, even as she recognized the truth in his concern. An unmarried woman staying under the roof of an unmarried man, regardless of the circumstances, could indeed invite speculation. Thank you for your thoughtfulness, she said softly. But please don't feel you need to distance yourself on my account. These past days have been. She paused, searching for the right word. Precious to me. Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, a warmth that had been absent since the sheriff's visit. They've been precious to me as well, he admitted quietly. The acknowledgement hung between them, neither willing to examine too closely what it might mean. Instead, they returned to their meal, the tension eased but a new awareness taking its place, an awareness that their time together was limited and all the more valuable for it. That night, Josephine dreamed of the frozen river where Matthew had found her, but in the dream, he didn't arrive in time. She woke gasping, tears on her cheeks, the terror of freezing to death still vivid in her mind. Rising from bed, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and moved to the window. The moon illuminated the snow-covered ranch yard, peaceful and still. Alive. She was alive because of the man sleeping across the hall, the man who had wrapped her in his coat and carried her to safety. A floorboard creaked behind her and she turned to find Matthew in the doorway, concern etched on his features. I heard you cry out, he explained, visibly hesitant to enter her room. Are you all right? A nightmare, she admitted, clutching the blanket tighter. About the river. Understanding crossed his face. Those take time to fade. Did you have them too, after your parents? Matthew nodded slowly. Still do sometimes, less often now. In the moonlight filtering through the window, his face appeared younger, more vulnerable than the composed exterior he typically presented. Josephine had a sudden, overwhelming urge to cross the room to him, to offer comfort as he had offered her salvation. Instead, she remained by the window, separated by more than just the physical space between them. I should let you get back to sleep, Matthew said, already stepping back into the hallway. Matthew, she called softly, stopping him, thank you, not just for checking on me now, but for everything. I don't think I've said it properly. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, his expression hidden in shadow. You don't need to thank me, Josephine, not ever. The way he said her name, like something precious, lingered in her mind long after he'd gone, making sleep elusive for the remainder of the night. The following days brought a gradual thaw, the temperature rising enough to begin melting the accumulated snow. With it came increased activity on the ranch, as pathways were cleared and regular chores became easier to accomplish. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Josephine's arrival, Matthew surprised her by saddling 2 horses. If you're feeling up to it, he said, I thought you might like to see more of the ranch than just the yard. Delighted by the prospect, Josephine quickly donned the buffalo coat that had become almost like a second skin during her stay. Though she'd never been an accomplished rider, the gentle mare Matthew selected for her was responsive and easy to manage. They rode at a leisurely pace, Matthew pointing out landmarks and sharing the history of the land. The Evans Ranch, she learned, encompassed nearly 2,000 acres with natural boundaries of rivers and ridgelines. My father started with just 100 acres, Matthew explained as they paused atop a rise overlooking a spectacular valley. Added more each year as he could afford it. Said good land was the only investment that never depreciated. He was clearly a wise man, Josephine replied, taking in the breathtaking vista, to build all this from nothing. He had help, Matthew said, his gaze distant. My mother was as much a part of building this ranch as he was. Different contributions, but equally vital. Josephine thought about the woman whose dress she now wore, whose books lined the cabin shelves. You must miss them terribly. Every day, Matthew acknowledged, but they left me a legacy worth preserving. That helps. As they continued their ride, Matthew showed her a secluded hot spring that remained unfrozen even in the depths of winter. The local tribes considered it sacred, he explained. My father made a promise never to develop this area, to leave it as nature intended. Steam rose from the mineral-rich water, creating an almost mystical atmosphere among the surrounding snow-covered pines. Josephine dismounted to get a closer look, captivated by the beauty of the place. It's like something from a fairy tale, she breathed, kneeling to trail her fingers through the warm water. Matthew watched her, something soft in his expression. My mother used to say the same thing. On their return journey, they took a different route, passing a small, well-tended graveyard enclosed by a wrought iron fence. Without needing to ask, Josephine knew this was where Matthew's parents rested. He paused, seeming to debate internally, then dismounted and opened the gate, gesturing for her to join him if she wished. Understanding the significance of the invitation, Josephine carefully tied her horse beside his and followed. 3 headstones stood within the enclosure, 2 larger ones side by side and a smaller one apart from the others. Matthew stopped before the paired stones, removing his hat respectfully. "James and Martha Evans," Josephine read softly. "Beloved husband and wife, devoted parents. They rest together as they lived in love and faith. My father had the stones carved and set before my mother passed," Matthew explained. "Said he wanted them to be together in death as in life." Moving to the 3rd stone, smaller and weathered by more years, Josephine saw it belonged to a child, Elizabeth Evans, aged 4 years, daughter of James and Martha. "My sister," Matthew said quietly, following her gaze. "Scarlet fever long before I was born." They rarely spoke of her, but Mother kept a lock of her hair in a locket she always wore. The intimacy of this revelation, this sharing of family grief, moved Josephine deeply. She reached for Matthew's hand without thinking, her fingers curling around his. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said simply. Matthew's fingers tightened around hers, warm and solid despite the winter chill. "It felt right," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for you to know them in some small way." They stood together for several minutes more, hands linked, before silently returning to their horses. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, each lost in private thoughts. Yet Josephine felt a new connection had formed between them, one deeper than the gratitude of a rescued stranger or the camaraderie of shared tasks. That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Matthew broke their companionable silence. The snow's melting fast with this thaw. Roads to Silver Creek should be passable within days. Though she had known this moment would come, Josephine felt her heart constrict at the reminder that her time at Evans Ranch was drawing to a close. "Yes," she managed, focusing on the knitting in her lap, another skill she'd revived during her stay. "I suppose I should prepare for departure." "Samuel will escort you," Matthew continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Safer that way with those bandits still at large." "That's very kind," Josephine replied automatically, though the thought of leaving brought an unexpected surge of desolation. Matthew hesitated, then added, "You've become a part of this place, Josephine. It will seem different without you." The admission, simple as it was, gave her courage. "I've felt more at home here these past weeks than I have anywhere since my father died." Their eyes met across the space between them, so much left unspoken. Matthew opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it again, returning his attention to the book in his hands. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Samuel returned from checking fence lines, his expression grave as he entered the cabin where Josephine and Matthew were having breakfast. "Rustlers," he announced without preamble. "They hit the Petersons' place last night, took 20 head of cattle and burned the barn." Matthew was on his feet immediately. "Anyone hurt?" "Peterson's youngest boy caught a bullet in the shoulder. He'll live, but the doctor's been called from Casper. And the rustlers, heading north, looks like. Sheriff's forming a posse." Samuel's eyes met Matthew's. "He's asking for volunteers. Says they're the same gang from the stagecoach robberies." A muscle ticked in Matthew's jaw. "When?" "Riding out at noon." Matthew nodded once, decision made. "I'll be there." Josephine watched the exchange with growing alarm. "You're joining the posse." "These men need to be stopped," Matthew said simply, "before anyone else gets hurt." "But it's dangerous," she protested, fear clutching at her heart. "Yes," he acknowledged, "but necessary." As Matthew and Samuel discussed preparations, Josephine stood frozen, the reality of frontier justice suddenly very immediate and frightening. This wasn't the orderly legal process she knew from Philadelphia, with courts and lawyers and proper procedures. This was men with guns riding after other men with guns, with the very real possibility that not everyone would return. When Samuel left to saddle the horses, Josephine followed Matthew to his room, where he was collecting ammunition and checking his rifle. "How long will you be gone?" she asked from the doorway, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hard to say. Days, possibly longer if the trail is difficult." He glanced up at her, his expression softening slightly. "Samuel will return to the ranch after seeing me to town. You won't be alone." "That's not what concerns me," she said quietly. Matthew set down his rifle, crossing the room to stand before her. "I've done this before, Josephine. I know these mountains. And the men you're pursuing, they know them too, and they've already shown they're willing to kill. Which is why they need to be stopped." His voice was gentle but firm. "This is part of life out here. We protect our own." Something in the way he said "our own" made Josephine wonder if he included her in that category. The thought both comforted and terrified her, because it meant he considered her worth fighting for, worth risking his life to keep safe. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered, unable to articulate the depth of her fear for him. Matthew's eyes searched hers, something unreadable in their blue depths. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand to her cheek, his touch feather-light. "I promise," he said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with everything unsaid. Josephine leaned imperceptibly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. For an instant, she thought he might lower his head to hers, might finally bridge the distance they had both so carefully maintained. Instead, Samuel's voice called from outside, breaking the spell. Matthew's hand fell away and he stepped back, resuming his preparations with outward calm. "I should be ready within the hour," he said, his voice steadier than Josephine felt. She nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and retreated to the kitchen to prepare food for his journey. As she worked, her hands trembled slightly, the reality of the danger he was riding into becoming increasingly clear. When it was time for Matthew to leave, Josephine stood on the porch, watching as he secured his provisions to his saddle. Samuel had already mounted, waiting patiently a short distance away to give them privacy. "The stew in the pot should last several days," Josephine said, falling back on practical matters to mask her turmoil, "and there's fresh bread in the tin." "Thank you," Matthew replied, tightening a final strap. Satisfied with his preparations, he turned to face her. "If I'm not back within a week, Samuel will take you to Silver Creek as planned." The thought of leaving without seeing Matthew again was unbearable. "I'll wait," she said firmly. "However long it takes." A complex emotion crossed Matthew's features, surprise, followed by something deeper and more profound. "Josephine, please come back," she interrupted, unable to maintain her composure any longer. "Just come back." In 2 strides, Matthew closed the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, and this time there was no hesitation as he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was brief but fervent, a promise more binding than words. When he pulled away, his eyes held hers with burning intensity. "I will come back to you," he said, each word weighted with conviction. "Remember that." Then he was mounting his horse, nodding once to Samuel, and they were riding away, leaving Josephine standing on the porch with the ghost of his kiss still on her lips and the weight of his promise in her heart. The days that followed were among the longest of Josephine's life. She threw herself into ranch chores with almost frantic energy, helping Samuel and Pete with tasks that would normally have fallen to Matthew. The physical labor helped distract her from constant worry, though her thoughts inevitably returned to Matthew each night as she lay awake, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he was thinking of her too. On the 4th day after Matthew's departure, Samuel received word from a passing neighbor that the posse had tracked the rustlers into the mountains north of Silver Creek. 2 of the bandits had been captured, but the others remained at large, leading the lawmen on a difficult chase through treacherous terrain. "No casualties reported on our side," Samuel assured Josephine, seeing her distress. "Matthew knows those mountains better than most. He'll be fine." She nodded, clinging to this reassurance, though it did little to ease the hollow feeling in her chest. The kiss they had shared there first and only replayed in her mind constantly, along with all the things left unsaid between them. On the morning of the 6th day, Josephine woke from a fitful sleep to the sound of hoofbeats. Heart pounding, she rushed to dress and hurried outside, praying it was Matthew returning. Instead, she found Sheriff Dalton dismounting in the yard, his expression grim. Samuel emerged from the barn, hurrying to meet him. "Sheriff," Samuel called. "News." Josephine froze on the porch steps, sudden terror gripping her as she registered the sheriff's solemn demeanor. "We got them all," Dalton announced, removing his hat. "Last two tried to ambush us in a narrow pass, didn't work out so well for them. And our men," Samuel pressed, glancing worriedly at Josephine. "Two wounded Jenkins took a bullet in the leg, Peterson a graze to the arm." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes moving to Josephine. "And Evans was hit." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "How badly?" she managed, her voice barely audible. "Took a bullet to the shoulder. Lost some blood, but the doc says he'll recover with proper rest. He's at the clinic in Silver Creek now." Relief washed over Josephine, so powerful she had to grip the porch railing to remain standing. He was alive, injured but alive. "I need to go to him," she said, already turning back toward the cabin to collect her things. Sheriff Dalton nodded. "Figured you might. That's partly why I rode out to escort you back to town if you wished." Within the hour, Josephine had packed her few belongings and was mounted on Matthew's gentle mare, riding between Sheriff Dalton and Samuel toward Silver Creek. The journey took most of the day, following trails still muddy from the recent thaw. By the time they reached the small frontier town, the sun was beginning to set, painting the modest collection of wooden buildings in golden light. The doctor's clinic was a small structure adjacent to his home on the main street. Josephine barely waited for the sheriff to help her dismount before hurrying inside, her heart in her throat. The clinic consisted of a waiting area and two small treatment rooms. A middle-aged woman looked up from her desk as Josephine entered. "May I help you? I'm here to see Matthew Evans," Josephine said, removing her hat. "I understand he was brought in with a gunshot wound." The woman, presumably the doctor's wife, studied her with open curiosity. "And you are?" "Josephine Lambert. I've been staying at Mr. Evans' ranch since he rescued me from freezing to death by Clearwater River." Recognition dawned in the woman's eyes. "The new school teacher. Yes, we've heard about you. I'm Mrs. Finley, the doctor's wife. Mr. Evans is in the back room resting." She led Josephine through a door into a small recovery room where Matthew lay on a narrow bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his face pale but peaceful in sleep. The sight of him alive, breathing, brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "He lost quite a bit of blood," Mrs. Finley explained quietly. "But my husband removed the bullet cleanly. No signs of infection so far. He needs rest and time to heal, but he should make a full recovery." "May I sit with him?" Josephine asked, unable to take her eyes from Matthew's face. "Of course, I'll bring you some tea." Left alone with Matthew, Josephine moved to his bedside, gently taking his hand in hers. His skin was warm, reassuringly alive, though his usual strength seemed diminished in unconsciousness. "You promised to come back," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But not like this." "Not hurt." Matthew stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, his eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. For a moment he seemed disoriented, then his gaze focused on her face and clarity returned. "Josephine," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," she replied, squeezing his hand gently. "Where else would I be?" A ghost of his usual smile touched his lips. "Teaching school," I thought. "That can wait, you're more important." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, more revealing than she had perhaps intended. Matthew's fingers tightened around hers. "I kept my promise," he said softly. "I came back to you." "Yes," she agreed, tears threatening again. "Though I would have preferred you return without a bullet hole." "An oversight on my part," he conceded, his attempt at humor undermined by a wince as he shifted position. "Don't move," Josephine urged. "You need to rest." Matthew's eyes held hers, suddenly serious. "I had a lot of time to think, tracking those men through the mountains." "About what? About you, about us." His voice strengthened with conviction. "About how I don't want you to go to Silver Creek to teach." Josephine's breath caught. "What do you mean, I want you to stay at the ranch?" "With me." His free hand came up to touch her cheek, an echo of their parting gesture. I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a short time. But when I was lying wounded, thinking I might not make it back, all I could think about was you, your smile, your voice, the way you've brought life back to my home. Matthew, let me finish, he insisted gently. I don't have much to offer beyond the ranch and my promise to work every day to make you happy. But if you could see yourself building a life there, a life with me, I would be honored to call you my wife. The words she had scarcely allowed herself to hope for hung in the air between them. Josephine's heart felt too full for her chest, joy and uncertainty warring within her. There's something you should know, she said quietly. About why I left Philadelphia. Matthew waited, his gaze steady and accepting. I was engaged, she began, the words difficult even now. To a man my parents approved of, a banker's son, respectable and well-connected. I thought I loved him until I discovered he was already married to a woman in another city. Matthew's expression darkened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. When I broke the engagement, he was furious. He spread rumors that I had been improper with him. My reputation was ruined. Even my mother believed him over me. The old pain surfaced briefly before she pushed it aside. The teaching position in Silver Creek was my chance to start fresh, somewhere no one knew me or the scandal. And now, Matthew asked softly, what do you want, Josephine? She looked at him, this man who had saved her life, who had opened his home and eventually his heart to her. The answer was suddenly perfectly clear. I want you, she said simply. I want the ranch and the life we could build there together. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm exactly where I belong. The joy that transformed Matthew's features was worth every moment of pain that had led her to this point. He pulled her closer, ignoring his injury, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future awaiting them. I love you, Josephine Lambert, he murmured against her lips. Have since I found you by that frozen river. And I love you, Matthew Evans, she replied, her heart overflowing, since you wrapped me in your coat and promised me forever, Doctor. Finley, entering to check on his patient, found them thus hands entwined, foreheads touching, lost in a moment of perfect understanding. He cleared his throat discreetly, smiling at their startled expressions. I see my patient is recovering nicely, he observed dryly. Though I must insist on proper rest, Mr. Evans, if you wish that shoulder to heal correctly. Josephine moved to step away, but Matthew kept firm hold of her hand. Doctor, he said, his voice stronger than before, you should know that Miss Lambert has just agreed to become my wife. The doctor's eyebrows rose, but his smile was genuine. Congratulations to you both. That's excellent news, though perhaps not surprising to anyone who's heard the story of how you met. As doctor. Finley examined Matthew's wound, pronouncing it clean and healing well. Josephine reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A stagecoach robbery, a frozen river, a cowboy with a buffalo coat, and a gentle heart, all conspiring to lead her not to the life she had planned, but to the one she was meant to have. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, once Matthew's shoulder had healed enough for him to stand comfortably through the ceremony. The entire community of Silver Creek turned out for the occasion, along with neighboring ranchers and their families, all eager to witness the union that had begun so dramatically by a frozen river. Josephine wore a simple white dress ordered from Casper, with a blue ribbon at the waist that matched Matthew's eyes. The schoolchildren she would never teach presented her with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift, each square lovingly stitched with good wishes for the couple's future. Sheriff Dalton, who had helped capture the men who had inadvertently brought them together, stood as Matthew's best man. Samuel gave Josephine away, his weathered face beaming with approval as he placed her hand in Matthew's before the minister. Their vows, spoken in the small church under the watchful eyes of friends and neighbors, were simple but profound promises of love, fidelity, and partnership for all the days to come. When Matthew slipped his mother's ring onto Josephine's finger, the gold band that had symbolized one enduring love now blessed to represent another, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared, his voice carrying to the rafters. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. As Matthew leaned down to kiss his bride, a shaft of sunlight broke through the church's stained glass window, bathing them in multicolored light, a benediction from heaven itself on their union. The celebration afterward at Evans Ranch was joyous and lively, with fiddle music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army. Josephine moved among their guests with natural grace, already every inch the rancher's wife, as she ensured everyone was comfortable and well fed. Matthew watched her from across the yard, his heart fuller than he had ever believed possible. Samuel approached, handing him a glass of whiskey. "Your parents would be proud," the old foreman said, following Matthew's gaze to Josephine. "She brings life back to this place." "That she does," Matthew agreed softly. "I never expected to find her, Samuel, certainly not half frozen by a river in the dead of winter." Samuel chuckled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he drops blessings right in our path or by our rivers." As the celebration continued into the evening, Matthew found moments to pull Josephine aside, stealing kisses and whispered promises of the life awaiting them. The guests gradually departed as night fell, returning to their own homes with well wishes and knowing smiles for the newlyweds. Finally alone in the cabin that was now truly their home, Matthew took Josephine's hands in his, studying her face in the firelight. "Happy?" he asked simply. Josephine's smile was radiant. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." He drew her into his arms, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen to share his life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Evans. I've been home since the moment you found me," she replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "Everything since has just been finding my way back to where I belong." As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Josephine truly came into her own as mistress of Evans Ranch. The home that had once been simply functional under bachelor care blossomed under her influence, with a thriving kitchen garden, curtains at the windows, and flowers on the table. Yet her contributions extended far beyond domestic comforts. With her education and quick mind, she took over the ranch accounts, implementing systems that increased efficiency and profitability. She learned to ride as well as any cowhand, helped with calving in the spring, and could shoot straight enough to defend the homestead if needed, though Matthew made certain she rarely had cause to do so. Their partnership, forged in the extremes of winter cold and human compassion, deepened with each passing day. The challenges of ranch life, drought, illness, market fluctuations they faced together, drawing strength from the bond between them. On their first anniversary, Matthew surprised Josephine with a piano for the cabin, an extravagance he had secretly arranged to have shipped from Denver. Her joy as her fingers touched the keys, music filling their home for the first time, was a memory he would treasure always. "This must have cost a fortune," she breathed, playing a few experimental notes. Matthew shrugged, leaning against the doorframe with a smile. "We had a good year, and music was missing from our home." That night, after she had played every piece she could remember from her childhood lessons, Josephine joined Matthew on the porch, where he sat watching the stars emerge over their land. "I have a gift for you as well," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "Though it won't arrive for several months yet," Matthew's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A baby, you're certain?" Josephine nodded, her eyes shining. "Doctor Finley confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a child, Matthew." The wonder and joy that transformed his face was everything she had hoped for. Matthew gathered her in his arms, his happiness too great for words, expressed instead in the tender kiss he pressed to her lips. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Matthew's hand rested protectively over the place where their child grew. "Boy or girl, doesn't matter," he murmured sleepily. "As long as they have your heart and spirit." "And your strength and integrity," Josephine added, covering his hand with her own. "Our child will know love," Matthew promised, "every day of their life." 7 months later, as winter once again blanketed Evans Ranch in pristine white, their daughter was born, Martha Elizabeth Evans, named for the grandmother and aunt she would never meet but whose legacy she would inherit. As Josephine nursed their infant daughter before the fireplace, wrapped in the buffalo coat that had once saved her life, Matthew knelt beside them, overwhelmed by the perfection of the moment. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed, gently stroking his daughter's downy head. "Never imagined I deserved it." "Everyone deserves happiness, Matthew," Josephine replied, her eyes soft with love for him. "Sometimes we just need help finding it." Outside, snow began to fall, each flake unique and perfect, adding to the blanket that protected the sleeping earth. Inside, the family Matthew had never expected to have gathered close around the hearth, bound together by love that had begun with an act of compassion beside a frozen river. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Josephine asked softly, watching the firelight play across their daughter's peaceful face. "If you hadn't found me that day," Matthew shook his head slowly. "I prefer to think it couldn't have happened any other way, that somehow we were always meant to find each other." Josephine smiled, remembering the desperate cold, the approaching darkness, and then the silhouette of a man on horseback appearing like an answer to a prayer. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps some stories are written in the stars long before we live them." "Our story," Matthew said, taking her free hand in his, "is just beginning." And as their daughter slept peacefully in her mother's arms, as the fire crackled in the hearth of the home they had made together, both knew it was true. What had begun with a coat offered in compassion had become a life shared in love, a forever that neither had been seeking but both had been destined to find. There, by a frozen river in the vast Wyoming wilderness.